The day everything shattered began like any other. Inside the silent mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, a place where power could choke off every cry for help and bury every secret behind gray stone walls and heavy velvet drapes. Iris had learned how to move quietly there. As a caregiver, she knew which floorboards would creak, which doors would shriek if opened too fast, which rooms stayed cold even if the fireplace had burned all night. She also knew Eleanor's call before anyone else did. That 68-year-old woman had a way of calling the name of her deceased daughter that didn't sound like weeping, but like a prayer, as though she were asking memory whether Rosalie might come home to visit her mother today. Iris always answered. She always came to the bedside, took that trembling hand, and sang softly the songs Eleanor had once sung to her little girl long ago. She always did, until that morning, when Iris found herself frozen in place, dropping to her knees to beg, her voice breaking in a mansion that suddenly felt too vast to hold mercy. The boss, Rhett Callahan, the man who held half of Chicago's underworld in his fist, was in New York. And his fiancée, Veronica Hayes, had arrived earlier than expected, the click of her heels on the marble floor like a countdown to something terrible. Veronica was beauty honed into a weapon. A woman who smiled with her lips while her eyes never stopped calculating. She had never hidden her hatred for Eleanor. The elderly mother Rhett loved more than his own life, the one woman who dared to call Veronica a snake to her face. Veronica called Eleanor a burden, never once called her mother. And Iris had learned to stand a little closer each time Veronica entered the room, as if being close enough could shield the fragility that was slowly fading from the old woman's eyes. That morning, autumn sunlight slipped through the velvet curtains and fell across Eleanor's silver hair like a farewell. Veronica stood there with a white pillow in her hands, not to kill, but to threaten, to control, to turn fear into the language of that room. And Iris, a 27-year-old woman with green eyes that had witnessed too much darkness, realized that her silence was no longer armor. It had become complicity. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to support those who dare to stand up and protect the vulnerable. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories that come next, where human goodness always wins. But to understand how Iris found the strength to stand between a snake and its prey, we must look back to where it all began. 6 months ago, Iris Whitmore stood in front of the wrought iron gate, more than 10 feet tall, of the Callahan estate, an old battered suitcase in her hand and a wrinkled letter of introduction tucked into her coat pocket. She was 27, but her green eyes carried the shadow of someone who'd lived through far more than her years should have held. Wind off Lake Michigan cut across her face like ice, but Iris had been used to cold for a long time. She'd grown up in the cold of St. Catherine's Orphanage on the outskirts of Boston, where the children no one wanted were stacked into bunk beds and taught that silence was gold, obedience was silver, and dreams weren't worth a single cent. Iris lost her parents in a car accident when she was 5, too young to remember their faces, but old enough to remember what it felt like to be left alone in a bright emergency room washed in harsh white light. When she was 11, a family adopted her, and Iris thought it was a miracle, but the miracle turned into a nightmare fast, when the adoptive father started drinking and the adoptive mother started closing her eyes and looking the other way. The scars on Iris's wrists weren't self-inflicted. They were the marks of nights she tried to run and was dragged back, of times she screamed and no one listened, of 5 years living in hell before she turned 16 and the system was forced to step in. After that, Iris taught herself, worked for herself, and rebuilt herself from ashes. She became a professional caregiver because she understood what it meant to need care and have no one there. She'd cared for an elderly woman with Alzheimer's for 3 years, loved her like a real grandmother, and when the woman died, Iris cried as if she'd lost the last family she had left in the world. Now she stood here, in front of a home larger than anywhere she'd ever set foot, holding on to a fragile hope that maybe, this time, things would be different. The gate opened after the security camera swept across her face, and Iris stepped onto the stone drive leading to the front door. The gardens on either side were trimmed with a perfection that felt almost unnatural, as if even the grass and trees had to obey some invisible law. The mansion rose before her with gray stone walls, a black tiled roof, and tall windows that seemed to look down at her with judgment. Iris swallowed, tightened her grip on the suitcase handle, and climbed the steps. The woman who opened the door looked to be around 62, her silver hair pinned up neatly, her face stern, but with something quietly gentle hidden deep in her eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patricia Walsh, the head housekeeper of the Callahan estate. She didn't smile as she led Iris inside, but she wasn't cold either. She simply watched, as if measuring whether this young woman had the strength to endure what was waiting ahead. Inside, the mansion felt colder than the air outdoors. Not the cold of temperature, but the cold of an absence of laughter, of rooms that were too large and too empty, of light slipping through velvet drapes without warming a single thing. Iris followed Mrs. Walsh down a long marble corridor, past expensive oil paintings and fresh flower arrangements with no scent. Everything was perfect. Everything was in its place. And yet everything felt drained of life. Mrs. Walsh stopped at an oak door and turned to Iris, her voice lowering as if she were afraid someone might hear. She said the job wouldn't be easy, that the master of the house was not a man to question, and that there were things in this mansion that were better left unseen. But if Iris truly wanted to help Eleanor, if she truly could make her smile again, then maybe this house needed her more than she realized. Iris listened, nodded, and didn't ask anything else. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the questions you weren't allowed to ask were more frightening than the answers you didn't want to hear. Mrs. Walsh pushed the oak door open, and Iris stepped into a room flooded with the light of an autumn afternoon. The room was larger than the small apartment Iris had once rented on the outskirts of Boston, with a soaring ceiling, pale patterned wallpaper, and white lace curtains that stirred softly in the breeze from a window left slightly open. But the first thing Iris saw wasn't the luxury or the expensive antiques arranged throughout the space. What she saw was a woman seated in a velvet armchair by the window, hair silver white like cloud, narrow shoulders trembling beneath a thin sweater, and eyes fixed on an empty distance, as if she were searching for something she'd lost a very long time ago. Eleanor Callahan was 68, but Alzheimer's had stolen more from her than age ever could. She sat there with both hands resting on her lap, fingers twisting together again and again in an unconscious habit. When she heard the door, she turned her head, and her blue-gray eyes settled on Iris's face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then those eyes suddenly lit up, shining as if filled with water, and her lips trembled as she shaped a name Iris had never heard, but would never forget. Rosalie. She called Iris Rosalie, her voice breaking like cracked glass, her hands reaching forward as if to pull Iris into her arms, and tears began to stream down her wrinkled cheeks. "You're home, Rosalie? You're home with your mother again?" Iris stood rooted to the spot, her heart cinching tight with pain. She looked to Mrs. Walsh, but the housekeeper only gave a small shake of her head, sorrow in her eyes. As if this happened so often there was nothing left to explain. Iris didn't know who Rosalie was, didn't know why Eleanor mistook her for that person, but she knew that look. She'd seen it in the mirror for 22 years. It was the look of someone searching for what was gone, someone waiting for a person who would never return. A loneliness so deep no words could hold it. Iris moved forward, slowly, gently, as if any sudden motion might shatter this fragile moment. She knelt beside the armchair, laid her hand over Eleanor's trembling hands, and spoke in the softest voice she could find. "I'm here, ma'am. I'm here now." Eleanor wept with an unrestrained, raw grief that had been bottled up for years, her hands gripping Iris's, as if clinging to a lifeline in a storm. She repeated the name Rosalie over and over, tangled with broken apologies Iris didn't understand, yet could feel the pain inside every syllable. "I'm sorry, Rosalie. I'm sorry, my child. I shouldn't have called you home. You shouldn't have died." Iris held her. Let Eleanor rest her head on Iris's shoulder. Let the sobs soak into her shirt. And she closed her eyes to stop her own tears from falling. She didn't know who Rosalie was, didn't know what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain. This woman was hurting. She was lonely. She was lost inside her own mind, and Iris couldn't leave her here alone. When Eleanor finally quieted and drifted to sleep in Iris's arms, Mrs. Walsh gently laid a blanket over her and signaled Iris into the hallway. The housekeeper looked at Iris differently now, no longer measuring, no longer guarded, but with something that came close to respect. She said it had been a long time since anyone had been able to calm Eleanor so quickly, that the old woman often screamed for hours whenever she remembered Rosalie, that perhaps this was a good sign. Then she paused, met Iris's eyes, and asked only one question. Was Iris certain she wanted the job? This wasn't a normal house, and Rhett Callahan wasn't a normal man. There were things Iris would see that she wasn't allowed to speak of, questions she would carry that she wasn't allowed to ask. If she stepped in, she had to understand it might not be easy to step back out. Iris looked toward Eleanor's door, where the elderly woman was sleeping deeply, her face finally peaceful after the storm of tears. She thought of the lonely years in the orphanage, of the nights she'd wished someone would hold her and say everything would be all right, of the way Eleanor's eyes had looked when she said the name Rosalie. Then Iris turned back to Mrs. Walsh and nodded. She'd stay. She'd take care of Eleanor. No matter what happened, she wouldn't abandon her, because Iris knew, better than anyone, what it meant to be abandoned. The first days in the Callahan mansion taught Iris many things no one ever put into words. She learned by watching, by listening, by memorizing the warning looks Mrs. Walsh gave her whenever she accidentally turned the wrong way or asked the wrong question. There were rooms she wasn't meant to enter, corridors she wasn't meant to walk through after 10 o'clock at night, faces she wasn't meant to look at directly. Iris memorized it all the way a child memorizes multiplication tables, because she understood that in this house, one small mistake could cost something far greater than a job. In the first week, Iris realized the Callahan mansion wasn't simply the home of a wealthy family. Men in black suits came and went without pause, their faces cold as stone, their eyes sweeping every corner as if searching for an invisible threat. They never spoke to Iris, never looked at her for too long, but she could feel the weight of their presence everywhere. There were nights she heard cars pulling up hard at the gate at 2 or 3 in the morning, heavy footsteps on the gravel, doors slamming shut. There were afternoons when she caught the distant echo of gunfire from the woods behind the estate, far away yet unmistakably clear, and no one inside acted surprised or afraid. Mrs. Walsh would only look at Iris in a way that said, "Don't ask, don't think, don't remember," and Iris would nod. She wasn't foolish. She'd lived long enough in darkness to recognize it when it stood right in front of her. The Callahans weren't a normal family. They were the Mafia, or something close to it. An underground power she didn't want to know and didn't need to know. The only thing she needed to know was that Eleanor was waiting for her on the second floor, and with each day that passed, the old woman needed her more. Iris focused her entire mind on caring for Eleanor. She woke at 6 in the morning to prepare breakfast, soft foods that were easy to swallow, the kind Eleanor liked. She sat beside her while she ate, gently wiping the drops of soup from her chin, waiting patiently when Eleanor forgot what she was doing halfway through. She took her into the garden on bright afternoons, let her sit on the stone bench beneath the maple tree, and listened as she told broken stories about a long-ago time Iris didn't belong to. Some days Eleanor was clear. She recognized Iris wasn't Rosalie and called her by her proper name, and in those moments her gaze was so gentle and so lucid, it made Iris want to cry. But there were other days when Eleanor sank deep into the past, calling Rosalie again and again, sobbing for her daughter, and Iris could only hold her, sing to her, and wait for the storm to pass. The other servants watched Iris with curiosity laced with pity. They whispered that the girl wouldn't last long, that Eleanor was too hard to care for, that so many others had come and gone before her. But Iris didn't care about the rumors. She was used to being underestimated, used to no one believing she could do anything at all. She only needed to prove it with her actions, day by day, hour by hour, in the small moments when Eleanor took her hand and smiled. Mrs. Walsh was the first to change the way she looked at Iris. The housekeeper began saving the best pieces of cake from the kitchen for her, began asking whether she'd slept enough, began calling her by her name instead of calling her the caregiver the way she had in the beginning. One evening, when Iris was sitting in Eleanor's room reading to her, Mrs. Walsh stood in the doorway and watched for a long time before turning away. Iris didn't know what the older woman was thinking, but she could feel something shifting inside this cold house. Maybe it was acceptance, maybe it was trust, or maybe it was simply hope that this time, at last, Eleanor would have someone who stayed. A month passed, and Iris learned something important about Eleanor's Alzheimer's. Trying to pull her back into reality wasn't always the best thing to do. There were mornings Eleanor woke with clear, bright eyes, said Iris's name correctly, and asked whether she'd slept well. But there were other mornings she opened her eyes and looked at Iris as if she were looking at someone returned from the dead, calling her Rosalie in a trembling voice full of love and pain. In the beginning, Iris had tried to explain, tried to gently remind her that she wasn't Rosalie, that Rosalie was gone. But every time she did, Eleanor would break apart in tears, sobbing and wailing as if she'd just lost her daughter all over again. And Iris realized she was accidentally killing Rosalie one more time inside Eleanor's mind. So she decided to change. She decided she'd play along. When Eleanor called her Rosalie, Iris stopped arguing. She smiled, took the older woman's hand, and answered in the gentlest voice she could manage. "I'm here, Mom. I'm home." The lies tasted bitter on her tongue, but when Iris saw Eleanor's face relax in happiness, her eyes lighting up as if 1,000 stars had risen there, she knew she'd done the right thing. Maybe it wasn't the truth, but it was what Eleanor needed. And sometimes love wasn't measured by truth, but by the peace it brought. Iris began singing to Eleanor every night before sleep. She didn't know what Rosalie used to sing, but she sang the songs she herself had heard in the orphanage. The old lullabies the sisters sang to soothe children who cried in the night. Amazing Grace, You Are My Sunshine, Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Eleanor would lie in bed, eyes closed, a dreamy smile on her lips, and sometimes she would whisper along with the words as if she were reaching for some distant memory. Some nights, she clutched Iris's hand and wouldn't let go, afraid that if she released it, her daughter would disappear again. Iris stayed right there beside her until Eleanor's breathing evened out, and her fingers finally loosened in sleep. During the day, Iris told Eleanor stories. She told the fairy tales she still remembered from childhood, about Cinderella and the glass slipper, about Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, about the little mermaid trading her voice for a chance to be human. Eleanor listened like a child, eyes wide. And now and then she would ask, "And then what? And then what?" her eagerness plain on her face. Iris also made up stories about a young girl traveling the world in search of her family, about bright adventures she'd never been allowed to live. And sometimes, while she told those stories, Iris realized she was telling the story of herself, of a secret longing she'd never dared to speak out loud. On beautiful afternoons, Iris pushed Eleanor's wheelchair out into the garden. The backyard behind the mansion stretched wide, with rose beds trimmed with careful hands, rows of maple trees burning red in the autumn sun, and a small pond where koi fish glided beneath the surface. Eleanor loved sitting by the pond most of all, watching the orange and white fish chase one another under the clear water. She would point to each one and give it a name, a different name every day because she couldn't remember what she'd called them the day before. Iris laughed with her, pretended to be surprised each time Eleanor announced she'd discovered a new fish, and the old woman would beam like a child receiving a gift. Slowly, what existed between them stopped being only caregiver and patient. It became something deeper, something warmer, as if Eleanor were truly the grandmother Iris had never had, and Iris were truly the granddaughter Eleanor had lost. There were moments when Eleanor was lucid and realized Iris wasn't Rosalie, when she didn't cry anymore. She would look at Iris with gentle eyes and say, "Thank you. You aren't Rosalie, but I still love you." In those moments, Iris had to turn her face away to hide her tears. Mrs. Walsh watched it all from a distance, and the old housekeeper's heart softened little by little. She began bringing up hot tea to Eleanor's room every afternoon, 1 cup for the older woman and 1 cup for Iris. She began telling Iris about the Callahan family, about Rhett, about Rosalie, about the days before tragedy came. And one evening, while Iris was folding laundry in the washroom, Mrs. Walsh walked in and placed a blue wool scarf into her hands. She said she'd knitted it herself. The weather would be turning cold soon, and Iris should wear it to stay warm. Iris looked at the scarf, looked at Mrs. Walsh, and for the first time since she'd left the orphanage, she felt like she belonged somewhere. 2 months after Iris stepped into the Callahan mansion, the true master of the house finally came home. That night, Iris was sitting beside Eleanor's bed as always, softly singing "You Are My Sunshine" to lull her to sleep. The pale gold glow of the bedside lamp filled the room with a gentle light. Eleanor lay peaceful with her eyes shut tight and a dreamy smile on her lips, and Iris had no idea that beyond the door left slightly ajar, a man was standing silent in the dark, listening to every word she sang, his heart aching as if someone were crushing it in their fist. Rhett Callahan was 36, over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the stance of a man more accustomed to giving orders than taking them. His face was angular, sharp as if carved from stone, with rough stubble from days without shaving, and eyes as cold gray as the Chicago sky on the bleakest winter day. People spoke of Rhett Callahan in fearful whispers, of the underground empire he ruled, of enemies who vanished without a trace, of the iron hand wrapped in velvet that he used to control half this city. But tonight, that powerful man stood outside his mother's room, his back against the wall, his eyes closed, and he let that familiar melody pull him into a past he'd tried to bury for 3 years. Rosalie used to sing this song. His sister, a 24-year-old girl with chestnut brown hair and a smile bright as morning sunlight, had once sat in the very place Iris was sitting now, singing this very song to their mother every night. Rosalie was the light of the Callahan family, the only one who could make Rhett laugh, the little sister he loved and protected with his life, but he hadn't protected her. 3 years ago, on a night of relentless rain, Rosalie drove home after their mother's call, and her car lost control on a slick mountain road. She died on impact, and Eleanor never recovered. Her Alzheimer's began right after Rosalie's funeral, as if her mind refused to accept reality and chose instead to flee into a world where her daughter was still alive. Rhett opened his eyes and looked through the narrow crack of the door into the room washed in warm light. He saw his mother sleeping deeply, her face strangely serene, without the constant furrows of worry, without the dried tracks of tears on her cheeks. Then he saw the girl who was singing, chestnut brown hair loose over her shoulders, a slim figure in the blue sweater Mrs. Walsh had knitted, and from this angle, in this moment, she looked like Rosalie in a way that hurt. Rhett had to clench his hands into fists to keep himself from stepping inside, from calling his sister's name, from breaking open under the weight of a longing he'd held back for too long. The song ended, and Iris gently set Eleanor's hand down, pulled the blanket higher to keep her warm. She bent to kiss the old woman's forehead, whispered goodnight, and then stood to turn off the lamp. Right then, she turned and saw a dark shape in the doorway. Iris's heart seemed to stop for a beat. She saw a tall man standing there, his face half lit and half shadowed, gray eyes fixed on her with an emotion she couldn't read. Fear, curiosity, and something deep she didn't dare name, all tangled inside her as they faced each other for the first time. Rhett was the one who broke the silence. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask what she was doing, because he already knew everything from the reports Mrs. Walsh had sent him over the past 2 months. He said only one thing, his voice low and rough, as if it had been too long since he'd spoken to anyone at all. That song. My sister used to sing that song. Iris stood still, not knowing how to respond. She didn't know about Rosalie beyond what Eleanor had accidentally revealed in her fevered confusion. Didn't know the pain the man in front of her was carrying, but she recognized something in his voice. Something so familiar it stung. It was the sound of loss, of loneliness buried beneath a hard shell, of a heart that had broken but still forced itself to beat. Iris knew that sound. She'd heard it in her own voice for 27 years. She lowered her head and said softly that she was sorry, that she hadn't known. Rhett didn't answer. He only stood there a moment longer, staring into the room where his mother slept. And then he turned and walked back into the darkness of the hallway. His footsteps echoed over the marble floor, farther and farther away, until only silence remained. Iris stayed there for a long time after he was gone, her hand still on the doorknob, her heart still racing out of rhythm. She didn't know what that moment had been, but she knew something had changed. The shadow had come home, and this house would never be the same again. The next morning, after Iris had finished feeding Eleanor breakfast and was getting ready to take her out to the garden as usual, Mrs. Walsh appeared in the doorway with a grave expression. The housekeeper said the master wanted to see her in his study, right now. Iris felt her heart pick up a beat, but she nodded, asked Mrs. Walsh to watch Eleanor for her, and then walked in the direction she indicated. Iris had never set foot in the east wing of the mansion, where the rooms devoted to Rhett Callahan's work sat behind doors that were always shut tight. This was forbidden ground, and being summoned here could mean something good or something very bad, nothing in between. Rhett's study was at the end of the hall, behind a heavy, dark oak door carved with intricate detail. Iris knocked twice, heard a low voice from inside say, "Come in," and then she pushed the door open and stepped through. The room was larger than she'd imagined, with a high ceiling, bookcases covering 3 walls, and a walnut desk positioned in front of a wide window that looked out over Lake Michigan. Rhett sat behind that desk, his back against a black leather chair, his hands laced together before his chest, his cold gray eyes fixed on her from the moment she crossed the threshold. Morning light poured in from behind him, casting a dark halo around his outline, making him look like a king on a throne waiting for a subject to come before him. Iris stopped in the middle of the room, neither moving closer nor backing away. She stood straight, her arms resting naturally at her sides, and she met the gaze of the man in front of her. She'd heard enough rumors about Rhett Callahan, about his power and his cruelty, about people who had trembled on their knees before him and still couldn't escape a brutal fate. But Iris didn't tremble. She'd faced real demons in her life, had looked into the eyes of an abuser, and survived to tell the story. Compared to what she'd lived through, the cold stare of a Mafia boss wasn't much to fear. Rhett studied her in silence for nearly a full minute, and Iris let him. She didn't lower her head, didn't look away, didn't twist her hands in nervous worry the way the other servants did. Finally, Rhett spoke. He asked about his mother's condition, asked how she was eating, how she was sleeping, whether she often remembered the present or still sank into the past. His tone was even, without emotion, as if he were asking about the state of a possession rather than a person. But Iris recognized the act behind that chill. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when he said the words "my mother," the brief flicker in his eyes as he waited for her answers. He wasn't heartless. He was only trying to pretend he was. Iris answered each question clearly and in detail. She spoke about Eleanor's good days and bad days, about the songs she liked to hear, about the stories that made her smile, about how sometimes she was lucid and knew Iris wasn't Rosalie and still loved her. Iris didn't embellish, didn't soften the edges, didn't say what she thought Rhett wanted to hear. She told the truth, because she believed Eleanor deserved to be understood exactly as she was, and Rhett deserved to know the truth about his mother, no matter how much it hurt. When Iris finished, the room fell quiet. Rhett was still looking at her, but something in his gaze had shifted. The cold scrutiny from the beginning was gone, replaced by something closer to curiosity, maybe even respect. Then he stood, came around the desk, and walked toward her. Iris stayed where she was, not stepping back even as instinct screamed warnings inside her. Rhett stopped less than a step away, nearly 8 inches taller than she was, his shadow falling over her like a black curtain. He looked down, and his eyes settled on her left wrist, where the sleeve of her sweater had slipped just enough to reveal faint scars that were still visible under the light. The scar lines weren't neat, weren't even, clearly not self-inflicted, but inflicted by someone else. Iris knew what he was seeing. She didn't tug her sleeve down, didn't hide it, didn't explain. She simply stood there and let him look, because those scars were part of her, and she'd stopped being ashamed of them a long time ago. Rhett didn't ask. He didn't say a word about what he'd just seen, but when he lifted his gaze to meet hers, something had changed, as if he'd read a chapter of her life without her speaking a single sentence. He only nodded, said 2 words, "You're doing well," and then turned back toward his desk. Iris understood it was the signal that the meeting was over. She dipped her head in a brief farewell and walked out, not knowing that behind her, Rhett stood by the window, watching her disappear down the hallway with a look even he couldn't understand. 1 week after the meeting in the study, Veronica Hayes arrived at the Callahan mansion in a gleaming black Bentley and a red dress as vivid as blood. Iris was pushing Eleanor's wheelchair through the garden when she heard the purr of the engine and the sharp click of heels on the stone path. She turned and saw a woman step out from the back seat, long black hair shining as it lifted in the wind, a face made up to porcelain perfection, and dark brown eyes, cold as stone, sweeping over the garden with undisguised contempt. Veronica Hayes was 32, the daughter of a powerful East Coast Mafia family, and Rhett Callahan's fiancée in a marriage arranged 2 years earlier to strengthen the alliance between 2 underground empires. Iris had heard Mrs. Walsh talk about Veronica, but hearing and seeing were 2 very different things. This woman was beautiful. Beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way, like a knife honed to perfection and wrapped in velvet. She moved as if the world should bow to her, as if even the air other people breathed was something she granted. Rhett appeared at the front door to greet her, and Iris watched Veronica loop her arms around his neck and kiss his cheek with the intimacy of a lover. But Iris also saw the way Rhett stood rigid, the way he didn't place a hand on Veronica's back, the way his eyes stayed ice cold, even while his mouth tried to form a social smile. This wasn't love. This was a transaction. Eleanor suddenly tightened her grip on Iris's hand, and when Iris looked down, she saw the old woman's face had changed color. Eleanor's eyes went wide, her lips trembled, and she whispered 2 words, "The snake," in a voice full of fear, as if she were staring straight at the devil. Iris didn't understand in that moment, but later she would. Eleanor hated Veronica, and Veronica hated Eleanor, a slow, burning feud that had lasted since the very first day Rhett brought her home to meet the family. Eleanor might have Alzheimer's, she might forget and confuse names and faces, but she never forgot what Veronica felt like. On her clearest days, She had looked Veronica in the eye and told her she wasn't worthy of her son, that she was greedy and wanted only the Callahan money and power, that if Rosalie were still alive she would never accept Veronica as a sister-in-law. Veronica had smiled, brushed it off, told Rhett his mother was ill and talking nonsense. But inside, Veronica never forgot those words, and she never forgave them. Iris turned Eleanor's wheelchair back toward the house, trying to avoid Veronica's path, but she wasn't quick enough. Veronica had already seen them, and she released Rhett and strode toward the garden with a sweet, false smile on her lips. Iris stopped, instinct making her step between Eleanor and the woman approaching, even though she knew that could be seen as crossing the line for a caregiver. Veronica halted in front of her, dark eyes traveling from Iris's head to her feet with open appraisal. She asked who this was, her voice sweet as honey and cold as ice. Mrs. Walsh appeared from somewhere, hurriedly introducing Iris as Eleanor's new caregiver, saying she'd been working for more than 2 months and was deeply devoted. Veronica listened, lifted her chin, and gave a smile Iris recognized at once as fake. She said, "Oh, so you're the one Mrs. Walsh can't stop praising in her reports, the one who calms Rhett's mother by pretending to be her dead daughter. What a creative method. Or should we call it exploitation?" The words were delivered gently, with a charming smile, but they cut Iris like knives. She understood immediately that Veronica was marking territory, letting Iris know her place, warning her not to cross any line. Iris didn't lower her head. She met Veronica's gaze and answered calmly that she would do anything she could to help Eleanor feel peaceful and loved. And if that meant playing Rosalie in the moments Eleanor needed it, she was willing to do that. Veronica's brow tightened slightly, unaccustomed to being answered back, even politely. She gave a thin smile and said she hoped the caregiver wouldn't forget she was only an employee, and there were things that didn't belong to her no matter how hard she tried. Then Veronica turned on her heel and walked back toward Rhett, who was waiting at the door, without looking back. Eleanor gripped Iris's hand even tighter, her whisper trembling. "That snake will swallow all of us, Rosalie. You have to be careful. You have to be careful of it." Iris knelt beside the wheelchair, held the old woman's hands, and murmured that she shouldn't worry, that Iris would be here, that she wouldn't let anyone hurt her. She didn't know then that promise would be tested to its very limit, that the snake Eleanor spoke of would not only threaten but strike, and that the real battle was only beginning. 2 weeks after Veronica appeared, Eleanor had a miraculous morning Iris would never forget. She woke with clear, bright eyes, looked at Iris, and said her name correctly. Not Rosalie, but Iris, her caregiver. Days of lucidity like this were rare, like precious gemstones dropped into the endless desert of forgetting, and Iris had learned to treasure every one of them because she never knew when they would come or when they would end. Eleanor asked to sit by the window, where the morning sunlight fell warm and she could look out at the garden, where beds of yellow chrysanthemums were blooming in full. Iris helped her sit up, draped an extra sweater over her shoulders, then pulled a chair close and sat beside her. For a long while, they said nothing, just watched the garden bathing in golden light. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice as light as breath, but every word clear and aching. She wanted to tell Iris about Rosalie, about her daughter, about the child she had lost. Iris took Eleanor's hand and listened in silence, letting her tell it in her own rhythm. Eleanor said Rosalie was the youngest, the light of the whole family, the only one who could make Rhett laugh out loud and make Eleanor feel life was still worth living after her husband died. Rosalie was 24, newly graduated from college, preparing to open a small gallery downtown because the girl loved art more than anything in the world. She had chestnut brown hair like her mother, a radiant smile like her father, and a kindness so deep Eleanor sometimes worried the world would hurt her. But Eleanor never imagined she would be the one to cause the greatest hurt of all. Eleanor's voice began to shake as she spoke of the fateful night 3 years before. She had been sick, only an ordinary flu, but she missed her daughter so much she called Rosalie and said she wanted to see her. Rosalie was at an exhibition more than 200 miles away. It was already dark, and rain had started to fall, but she still decided to drive home that same night because her mother had called. Eleanor said, "You don't have to rush. You can come tomorrow." But Rosalie laughed and said, "I miss you. Mom, I want to come home right now." Those were the last words Eleanor ever heard from her daughter. 2 hours later, the police called and said Rosalie's car had lost control on a slick mountain road and gone over the edge into a ravine. The girl died on impact. They said she didn't suffer, but Eleanor didn't believe them. How could they know? How could anyone know what the girl had thought in those last seconds? Tears slid down Eleanor's wrinkled face, but she didn't sob out loud. She simply let them fall, as if she'd cried too much over the past 3 years to have any strength left for sound. She said if she hadn't called, Rosalie wouldn't have driven through the rain at night. If she hadn't been selfish and demanded to see her, her daughter would still be alive. She had killed her child with a phone call, with the weakness of an old mother who missed her girl, and she didn't deserve forgiveness. Iris didn't speak. She rose, sank to her knees at Eleanor's feet, and wrapped her arms around her. She held on tight, let Eleanor rest her head on Iris's shoulder, let her tears soak into Iris's shirt, and Iris said in a broken voice that it wasn't her fault. Rosalie loved her. Rosalie wanted to come home to her. That had been the girl's choice because the girl loved her mother. Eleanor hadn't killed her daughter. She had only loved her child, and Rosalie had only loved her mother. There was no guilt in love. There was only the pain of loss. And Eleanor had the right to feel that pain, but she didn't have the right to punish herself for something she couldn't control. Eleanor cried in Iris's arms for a long time, so long the sunlight shifted from gold to orange and began to tilt toward the west. When she finally calmed, she lifted her head and looked into Iris's eyes with a clarity so steady it felt almost unreal. She said, "You aren't Rosalie, I know. You're Iris, and I love you, Iris. I love you because you stayed with me, because you didn't run, because you gave me a reason to wake up every morning. You're my daughter, not by blood, but by heart." Iris cried. She cried the way she'd never been allowed to cry, like an orphaned child of 27 years who had finally found someone willing to call her daughter. She said, "I love you too, Eleanor. I love you so much." That night, Iris couldn't sleep. Eleanor's words about Rosalie, about the pain of self-blame, about the love she had given Iris, all of it kept spinning through Iris's mind like a storm that wouldn't break. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, then decided to get up for a glass of water and maybe find a book to carry her through the night. She slipped on the blue sweater Mrs. Walsh had given her, then quietly left her room and walked down the dark hallway toward the library on the first floor. She discovered the room a few weeks earlier, a vast space lined with thousands of books stacked from floor to ceiling, with a soft armchair set beside the window and a reading lamp that cast a warm golden light. She often came there on sleepless nights, sat and read in silence, and never once ran into anyone. But tonight was different. When Iris pushed the library door open, she saw the light was already on, and a figure was sitting in the armchair she thought of as hers. Rhett Callahan sat there with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him, as if he were staring into a world no one else could see. He wasn't wearing a suit the way he did in the daytime, only a white dress shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and he looked more tired than Iris had ever seen him. At the sound of the door, he turned his head, and the two of them looked at each other in silence. Iris meant to apologize and back away, but Rhett spoke first. He asked if she couldn't sleep, his voice low and rough, lacking the usual chill and carrying a weariness he didn't bother to hide. Iris nodded and said she'd come to find a book. Rhett watched her for a moment, then tipped his head toward the chair across from him, an invitation without words. Iris hesitated for a few seconds, then stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and sat in the chair he indicated. She didn't know why she sat down instead of leaving. Maybe because she recognized something in his eyes, something painfully familiar, the look of someone who was alone in the middle of the night and didn't want to be alone. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Rhett took a sip of whiskey. Iris sat quietly, her gaze drifting over the rows of spines along the shelves. Then Rhett broke the silence with a question Iris didn't expect. He asked where she came from, where she'd lived before she came here, what she'd been doing. It wasn't the interrogating voice of a boss. It was the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to know another person. Iris looked at him, weighing how much to say, then decided to tell the truth. She told him about St. Catherine's Orphanage in Boston, about growing up lonely among hundreds of unwanted children. She told him about the family that adopted her when she was 11, about the adoptive father who drank, and the adoptive mother who closed her eyes and looked away, about 5 years of hell before she was freed. She told him about teaching herself, working for herself, building herself out of ashes, about the elderly woman with Alzheimer's she'd cared for and loved like a real grandmother, about the grief when the woman died and Iris found herself, once again, with no one left. Rhett listened in absolute silence, never interrupting, never commenting, simply listening as if every word mattered. When Iris finished, she realized her eyes were wet, and she turned her face away quickly to wipe the tears. She didn't understand why she'd told so much to a man who was almost a stranger. Maybe because late night made people more honest. Maybe because his silence made her feel safe enough to speak the things she'd never said to anyone. Rhett set his whiskey down on the table, stood, and walked toward her. Iris lifted her head to look at him, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't name. He stopped in front of her, then slowly lowered himself into the chair beside hers, close enough that she could smell the whiskey and the faint trace of sandalwood on him. He didn't speak. He only reached out, gently took her left wrist where the sweater sleeve had slipped up and exposed the faint scars. Iris wanted to pull away, but she didn't. She let him hold her hand, let his fingers trace the raised lines of old scars, careful as if he might hurt her even though the wounds had healed long ago. Rhett studied the scars for a long time, then lifted his gaze to meet hers. In a low, steady voice, he said she was stronger than she thought. She had survived things that should have destroyed a person, and she was still here, still able to love, still able to care for someone else even though she'd never truly been cared for herself. That wasn't weakness, that was strength. Iris felt tears spill over, and she couldn't stop them. In a choked voice, she told him he was, too. He was strong, but being strong didn't mean being alone. Rhett looked at her, and in that moment the ice in his eyes seemed to melt, just a little. He didn't answer, but he didn't let go of her hand either. They sat there in the quiet library, close to 3 o'clock in the morning, two lonely people holding hands in a sea of silent books, and neither of them wanted to break that fragile moment. Veronica Hayes wasn't someone you could fool easily. She'd lived in the Mafia world long enough to know how to read people, how to spot a threat before it had the chance to become truly dangerous, and she'd seen something change in Rhett Callahan's eyes. It was the morning after the night in the library, when Veronica came down for breakfast and saw Rhett standing by the dining room window, a cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze aimed toward the garden where Iris was pushing Eleanor's wheelchair along the path. Veronica paused in the doorway and watched her fiancé for a long time, and what she saw made her blood boil. Rhett was looking at that caregiver with an expression he'd never given Veronica. Not desire, not possession, but something deeper, softer, far more dangerous. It was the look of genuine concern, of curiosity that wanted to understand another human being, of something beginning to take root that even Rhett himself might not have recognized yet. Veronica stepped into the dining room and made sure her heels sounded loud enough to force Rhett to turn. She smiled sweetly and asked what he was staring at so intently. Rhett answered curtly that it was nothing, then turned away and sat at the table with the newspaper as if the conversation was over. Veronica sat across from him, took a sip of orange juice, and studied him through her long lashes. She was used to Rhett's indifference. She'd accepted that this marriage was a transaction, not love, but she wouldn't accept being replaced. She wouldn't accept losing the position she'd spent so long building. And she certainly wouldn't accept being beaten by an unknown caregiver girl with no money to her name. In the days that followed, Veronica began to watch more closely. She noticed the way Rhett asked Mrs. Walsh about his mother's condition more often than before, noticed the way he found excuses to pass Eleanor's room at times when he knew Iris would be there, noticed the way his eyes unconsciously searched for the brown-haired girl's silhouette whenever he entered a room. But what truly enraged Veronica wasn't Rhett. It was Eleanor. One afternoon, as Veronica passed the old woman's room, she heard Eleanor's voice, clear and lucid in a way that was rare. Eleanor was talking with Iris, and Veronica stopped outside the door to listen. Eleanor spoke about Rosalie, about missing her daughter. Then she took Iris's hand and said she had 2 daughters, Rosalie in heaven, and Iris here beside her. She called Iris her daughter, not her caregiver, not Rosalie, but Iris her daughter. Veronica stood outside the door, her nails digging into her palm until they nearly drew blood. That crazy old woman had never accepted Veronica, had called her a snake right in front of her own son, had looked at her like an enemy for 2 years, and now she was calling a hired girl her daughter. Iris Whitmore, an orphan with no family, no past, was being claimed as a daughter by Eleanor Callahan, while Veronica Hayes, the daughter of a powerful Mafia family, was treated like trash. It wasn't acceptable. It had to change. Veronica began to move, but she wasn't foolish enough to do anything obvious. She knew how to play this game, knew how to ruin someone without leaving a trace. The first step was small things that could be blamed on Eleanor's Alzheimer's. Veronica started shifting objects in the old woman's room when no one was watching, moving the armchair to a different spot, switching the vases around, changing the position of the wall clock. Small changes, but enough to leave Eleanor confused and panicked whenever she woke in a familiar room that suddenly felt strange. But Veronica's most vicious strike was the photographs. On Eleanor's bedside table, there were 3 framed photos in silver. One of Rosalie at her college graduation, one of the whole family together when Rosalie was little, and one of Eleanor holding her daughter on Rosalie's last birthday. Eleanor looked at those photos every day, touched them, spoke to them, and they were the thin thread that kept her tied to reality. Veronica hid the graduation photo first, sliding it into the bottom drawer of a cabinet no one ever used. Eleanor searched for it all day, crying and asking where Rosalie was, where Rosalie had gone, why Rosalie had left her. Iris tried to soothe her, searched the entire room and couldn't find it, and in the end, had to accept that maybe Eleanor had put it somewhere in a confused moment and forgotten. 1 week later, the second photo disappeared, then the third. Eleanor grew more frantic, more out of control, and there were nights she screamed Rosalie's name until her voice went hoarse. Iris almost didn't sleep, staying up through the night beside her, doing everything she could to keep her calm, and Veronica stood at a distance and watched, wearing a satisfied smile every time she heard the old woman's cries echo from the east wing of the mansion. This was only the beginning. She'd push Eleanor down until Rhett had no choice but to place her in a nursing home. And once Eleanor was gone, Iris would have no reason to stay. 1 arrow, 2 targets. Veronica was very pleased with her plan. Veronica's plan was unfolding exactly the way she wanted, until it wasn't. After 2 weeks of Eleanor spiraling into panic, sleeplessness, and hoarse screaming for Rosalie, Veronica decided it was time to deliver the finishing blow. One evening, when Rhett had just returned from a tense meeting downtown, Veronica met him in the living room with a glass of red wine and a worried expression performed to perfection. She said she needed to have a serious conversation with him about his mother. Rhett sat down, exhausted, and Veronica launched into the speech she'd prepared. She talked about Eleanor's condition getting worse, about nights of nonstop crying, about how Eleanor no longer recognized anyone, about the pain the whole family was being forced to endure. Then she offered the suggestion she'd been nursing for a long time. Maybe it was time to consider placing his mother in a high-end care facility, where there would be medical specialists on site, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where Eleanor would be looked after better than anything they could provide here. Rhett stayed silent through Veronica's entire speech, his face giving nothing away, but Veronica knew him well enough to recognize the danger in that silence. When she finished, Rhett set his whiskey down on the table with a dry, hard thud, then looked straight into her eyes with a stare as cold as ice. In a low, certain voice he said his mother wasn't going anywhere. She would stay here, in this house, where she'd lived for 40 years, where her memories were, where Rosalie was. He would never push his mother into a strange facility to die alone, among people she didn't know, and he didn't want to hear that suggestion again. His voice wasn't loud, but every word carried the weight of a final verdict with no appeal. Veronica felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept it under control. She shifted tactics, trading worry for hesitation, as if she were debating whether she should even say it. Then she let a line fall as if by accident, that maybe the problem wasn't only the illness, maybe it was the caregiver. She said that since the girl Iris arrived, Eleanor's condition seemed worse, not better. Maybe Iris wasn't capable enough, or maybe the way she pretended to be Rosalie was pushing Eleanor deeper into delusion instead of helping her face reality. Veronica suggested they should replace the caregiver with someone new, someone more professional, with higher credentials, not an orphan girl of unclear background. Rhett stared at Veronica for a long time, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to read what was hidden beneath her words. Then he stood. He didn't answer. He only told her he would have Dr. Pierce come examine his mother tomorrow, and every decision would be based on an expert evaluation, not speculation. Veronica nodded, pretending to agree, but inside she began to worry. Dr. Raymond Pierce had been the Callahan family physician for 20 years, a man of 55 with sharp eyes and an integrity that couldn't be bought. He wouldn't be fooled as easily as others. Dr. Pierce arrived the next afternoon, carrying his medical bag and his usual calm expression. He spent nearly 2 hours in Eleanor's room, checking her health, speaking with her during the moments she was lucid, and watching how Iris interacted with her. Veronica waited in the hallway, tapping her nails against the doorframe in restless rhythm. When Dr. Pierce stepped out, Rhett was already there, and the two of them went into the study to speak in private. Veronica tried to follow, but Rhett stopped her with a cold look, and the door slammed shut in her face. Inside the study, Dr. Pierce presented his assessment bluntly and in detail. He said Eleanor's condition had indeed fluctuated lately, but that was normal for Alzheimer's patients. They moved through good stretches and bad stretches with no predictable pattern. However, what impressed him was Eleanor's emotional progress. She seemed more peaceful, happier, with more lucid moments than in previous examinations. And in his opinion, that was directly connected to the new caregiver. Dr. Pierce said that in 20 years of practice, he'd never seen anyone connect with an Alzheimer's patient the way Iris connected with Eleanor. Iris wasn't only providing care, she was giving love, and Eleanor could feel it. Iris was the best thing that had happened to Eleanor in the past 3 years, and if Rhett wanted his professional opinion, that opinion was to keep the girl at all costs. Rhett nodded, thanked Dr. Pierce, and walked him out. When he turned back, Veronica was standing in the hallway, her face trying to look composed while her eyes burned with fury. Rhett passed by her without stopping, saying only one short sentence, "Iris is staying," and he didn't want to hear any more suggestions about changing his mother's caregiver. Veronica stood there watching his back disappear down the hall, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. But she didn't scream, she didn't protest, she only stood there in silence, while inside her head new plans were already spinning. If she couldn't remove Iris this way, she'd find another way. If she couldn't push Eleanor out with a gentle proposal, she'd use something stronger. Veronica Hayes wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. 2 weeks after the confrontation involving Dr. Pierce, Rhett received word of an urgent situation in New York that required his presence in person. One of his most important business partners was threatening to blow up the deal, and if it wasn't handled in time, the damage could reach tens of millions of dollars, along with consequences far more complicated inside the underworld he ruled. Rhett didn't want to go, especially with his mother's condition still unstable and Veronica still in the mansion, wearing an expression he didn't fully trust. But he had no choice. Cole Brennan, his most loyal right-hand man, would go with him to ensure security and support the negotiations. Before leaving, Rhett called Mrs. Walsh into his study and told her to watch his mother carefully, to stay in contact if anything unusual happened. He also glanced toward the east wing, where Eleanor's room was, and inside him was a vague, unnamed unease. That morning, Iris woke, with a heavy feeling pressing on her chest. She didn't know why, but from the moment she opened her eyes, she had a sense that today wouldn't be like an ordinary day. Outside her window, the sky was a dull gray, dark clouds rolling in from Lake Michigan as if announcing a storm. Iris dressed quickly and went to Eleanor's room, letting out a breath of relief when she found the older woman still sleeping peacefully, her face calm inside her dream. Iris sat in the chair beside the bed, took Eleanor's hand, and tried to push away the unease gnawing at her. Maybe she was worrying too much. Maybe everything would be fine. But everything wasn't fine. Iris realized it when noon came, and the mansion grew strangely quiet. She went downstairs to the kitchen to get lunch for Eleanor, and found no one there. No cook, no servers, not even Mrs. Walsh. She searched the first floor and only encountered one servant hurriedly pulling on a coat to leave. When Iris asked what was happening, the servant said Miss Hayes had dismissed everyone early today, saying there was a family matter to handle, and no staff needed to stay. Mrs. Walsh had tried to object, but Veronica insisted it was an order, and the housekeeper had no right to refuse. Mrs. Walsh was forced to leave, but before she went, she'd tried to find Iris to warn her. Unfortunately, Iris had been in Eleanor's room at the time, and no one knocked. Iris stood in the empty kitchen, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She understood immediately what was happening. Veronica had deliberately cleared the mansion, removed every witness, leaving only 3 people behind: Eleanor, Iris, and herself. This wasn't coincidence. This was a plan. Iris ran up the stairs, her heart hammering, her feet stumbling on the marble steps. She had to get to Eleanor's room. She had to protect her. She didn't know what Veronica was plotting, but she knew one thing for certain: it wouldn't be anything good. As she rushed along the hallway toward the east wing, she caught a glimpse of Veronica moving toward Eleanor's room, her steps slow and confident, like a cat closing in on prey. And in Veronica's hand, Iris saw something that made the air in her lungs vanish. A white pillow. Iris ran faster, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground as she hurled herself toward Eleanor's room. But when she got there, Veronica was already inside, standing beside Eleanor's bed with a bright, false smile on her lips, the white pillow resting lightly in her hands as if it were nothing more than a harmless household item. Eleanor was awake, propped against the headboard, her face confused and frightened as she stared at Veronica. She recognized the snake. Even on the foggiest days of her mind, she always recognized Veronica, and her instincts always screamed that this woman was dangerous. Veronica turned when she heard Iris come in, and she smiled widely as if nothing unusual were happening. She said, "Oh, Iris is here. How lucky." She explained that she'd just come in to check on Mother and realized she didn't look well. Maybe she needed her medication. Veronica pointed down the hallway toward the medicine cabinet and told Iris to go get Eleanor's sedative, saying Dr. Pierce had prescribed it for moments when she became agitated. Iris stood in the doorway, looking from Veronica to Eleanor, then down at the white pillow in Veronica's hand. Every cell in her body was screaming, "Don't go. Don't leave her alone with that snake." But she had no proof, no legitimate reason to refuse what sounded like a reasonable request from the boss's fiancé. Obedience had been her armor for too long. It had protected her through the orphanage years, through the years of abuse, through jobs where she had to bow her head just to survive. And in that moment of hesitation, the old habit won over instinct. Iris nodded and took a few steps toward the hallway, pretending to comply. But a cold shiver stopped her before she reached the corner. She lingered just outside the heavy oak door, left slightly ajar, as a predatory instinct told her that the white pillow in Veronica's hands was no accident. She stood in the hallway, her heart pounding out of rhythm, then decided to turn back. She wouldn't get the medication. She would stay with Eleanor. She wouldn't let anything happen to her, even if it cost her the job or anything else. But when Iris turned around and pushed Eleanor's door open, what she saw made her heart stutter in terror. Veronica was standing over Eleanor's bed, bent close to the old woman's face, her lips moving as she whispered something into Eleanor's ear. The white pillow was still in her hands, not pressed over Eleanor's face, but held up like a silent threat, like a weapon ready to be used at any moment. Eleanor was crying, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm, her eyes wide with terror as if she were staring straight at a living devil. Iris stood frozen in the doorway and heard every word Veronica murmured into Eleanor's ear. Cruel words delivered in a voice sweet as honey, but each one a knife sawing into the fragile soul of an old mother. Veronica said Eleanor was a burden, that Rhett was tired of caring for her, that he'd wanted to put her in a nursing home for a long time but hadn't had the heart to say it. She said Rosalie died because of Eleanor, because Eleanor selfishly called her daughter home on a rainy night, because she hadn't thought about her child's safety, only about herself. She said that if Eleanor truly loved her family, she should disappear. She should stop being a burden. She should let Rhett live his life, instead of being chained to a senile old woman who didn't recognize anyone anymore. Eleanor's sobs broke into a sound that wasn't ordinary crying anymore, but the raw wail of a spirit being torn apart. She stammered Rosalie's name, Rhett's name, as if trying to cling to the people she loved so she wouldn't drown in the pit of despair Veronica was pushing her into. Her trembling hand lifted, as if to shove Veronica away, but she was too weak, too frightened, too powerless. Veronica only smiled, a smile cold as ice, and kept whispering poison. She said Iris didn't truly love her either, that the girl was only here for money, because she had no one else in the world, because she was just a pathetic orphan taking advantage of the Callahan family's kindness. She said no one loved Eleanor, no one wanted her here, and it would be better for everyone if she simply didn't exist anymore. Iris heard it all, and something inside her shattered. She saw Eleanor, the old woman she loved like a real grandmother, curled up on the bed, trembling and sobbing, being tortured by words more vicious than any physical weapon. She saw Veronica, a beautiful snake with deadly venom, savoring every second of her victim's pain. And she saw the white pillow, the symbol of a silent threat, of the power Veronica believed she held, of the helplessness she wanted to force onto anyone weaker than herself. Iris had been silent her whole life. She had bowed her head, obeyed, let others hurt her without daring to fight back. But she would not let it happen to Eleanor. Not today. Not ever. Iris rushed into the room, her legs buckling on the icy marble floor, and she dropped to her knees there, between Veronica and Eleanor, her hands clasped in front of her chest as if in prayer. Her voice shattered into fragments as she begged, "Please stop. Please don't do this. She's only an old mother. She hasn't done anything wrong. Please, I'm begging you." Iris didn't care about her pride anymore. Didn't care that she was kneeling at the feet of a woman she despised. Didn't care about anything except protecting Eleanor. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she looked up at Veronica with desperate eyes, pleading for a scrap of mercy from a heart she knew had turned to stone long ago. Veronica looked down at Iris kneeling at her feet, and the smile on her lips widened, more triumphant, more vicious, more cruel. She lowered the pillow onto the bed, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every second of this moment. Then she bent down to Iris's eye level and spoke in a voice sweet as honey laced with poison. She said Iris was pathetic, kneeling and begging like a loyal dog, but it wouldn't change anything. She said Iris should know her place, an orphan girl, an abandoned child, someone no one wanted, with no right to interfere in the Callahan family's affairs. Then Veronica straightened, pulled a thin stack of papers from her pocket, and threw them down in front of Iris like a slap. Iris looked at the scattered pages on the floor, and a cold dread seized her entire body as she realized what they were. Her file, records from St. Catherine's orphanage, with her name, her birth date, and the line that said her parents died in a car accident. No relatives to claim her. Records from the adoptive family, with notes about problem behavior and the need for psychological intervention, lies the abusive adoptive father had invented to cover his crimes. Photographs of the orphanage, photographs of Iris at 16 with hollow eyes and bruises on her arms that no one bothered to ask about. All the dark past Iris had tried to bury, all the pain she'd believed she'd left behind, was now scattered across the cold stone floor at her knees. Veronica laughed, a laugh as cold as ice water. She said she knew everything about Iris Whitmore, from the day she was born to the day she walked into this mansion. She knew about the orphanage, about the abusive family, about the years Iris lived like a ghost no one saw. She knew Iris was nothing, had nothing, and would never be anything. And if Iris dared to open her mouth about what happened today, Veronica would make sure she never found work anywhere. She would ruin Iris, drive her back to zero, back to the ashes she'd fought to escape for 27 years. Or worse. Veronica let the last words hang in the air, heavy with threat, heavy with everything a Mafia family could do to a nameless girl no one would remember. Iris knelt there, staring at the papers on the floor, staring at her past laid open like a wound. She heard Eleanor's sobs behind her, heard her calling Rosalie's name in desperation, and the sound tore at Iris's heart. Rosalie, 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 save your mother. My daughter, save your mother. Then, suddenly, Eleanor went silent. Not ordinary silence, but the terrifying stillness of a soul pushed past the edge. Iris turned her head and saw Eleanor sitting motionless on the bed, her eyes wide but empty, as if her spirit had left her body and only a hollow shell remained, no longer capable of pain. Tears still ran down her cheeks, but she wasn't crying anymore, wasn't calling any name, only staring into nothing, like a broken statue. And in that moment, seeing Eleanor destroyed, seeing the old mother she loved brought down not by physical violence but by cruel words, Iris felt something shift inside her. She looked down at the papers on the floor, looked at her past, and she realized something she hadn't understood in 27 years. That past didn't define her. What other people did to her didn't decide who she was. She had survived the orphanage, survived abuse, survived loneliness and despair. She had risen from the ashes not once but many times, and she wouldn't let Veronica Hayes, or anyone else, turn that past into a weapon against her. Iris lifted her head and looked straight into Veronica's eyes. Tears were still on her cheeks, but her eyes were no longer desperate. They were burning. She rose slowly to her feet, her legs still trembling, but her back straight, her chin high. She spoke in a voice that was no longer pleading, no longer shaking, but steady as steel tempered in fire. She said Veronica could know everything about her past, could use it to threaten her, could destroy her life. But Iris wouldn't be silent. She wouldn't let Veronica hurt Eleanor. She wouldn't let obedience and fear turn her into an accomplice to evil. Not today. Not ever. Veronica might think Iris was nothing, but Iris was the only thing standing between that snake and an innocent old mother. And she would not move. Veronica looked at Iris with undisguised shock, as if she couldn't believe a small mouse would dare stand up to a cat. But the shock quickly turned into anger, then into contempt. She took a step closer, crowding Iris, towering nearly half a head taller in her high heels, and stared down at her with eyes as cold as ice. She asked Iris who she thought she was, an orphan no one wanted, a cheap hired hand, daring to challenge her. Did she know who Veronica Hayes was? Did she know what the Hayes family could do to anyone who dared stand in their way? She said Iris should drop to her knees and apologize right now, and maybe Veronica would spare her life, only throw her out of the mansion instead of doing something far worse. Iris didn't step back. She stood there as if her feet had grown roots into the marble floor, and she met Veronica's gaze without blinking. In a voice strangely calm, she said she knew exactly who Veronica was. She knew what the Hayes family could do. She knew she was someone no one would remember, someone no one would look for if she disappeared. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that Eleanor didn't deserve to be treated that way, didn't deserve to be tortured by the cruel words of a woman who should have called her mother, and Iris would protect her, no matter the cost, even if it meant paying with her own life. She had lost too much in her life not to learn that some things were worth more than safety. Eleanor was one of those things. Veronica lifted her hand as if to slap Iris, but Iris didn't flinch, didn't shut her eyes, didn't move away. She simply stood there and waited, ready to endure whatever Veronica wanted to do to her. And maybe it was that calm, that lack of fear, that made Veronica stop. She understood that threats didn't work on someone who had nothing left to lose, that violence would leave evidence and make things more complicated. She lowered her hand, gave a thin smile, and said fine. If Iris wanted to play the hero, then play. But when Rhett came home and heard the story from Veronica's side, Iris would learn what regret felt like. Then Veronica turned her back, starting to walk out of the room as if the confrontation had ended exactly the way she wanted it to. But Iris didn't let her. The moment Veronica turned away, Iris moved to Eleanor's bed, gentle but fast, lifted the older woman upright, and gathered her into her arms. Eleanor was lighter than Iris expected, light as a dried leaf, and she didn't resist, didn't speak, only let Iris carry her like a tired child. Iris held her tight against her chest, felt the frail heartbeat against her ear, and whispered that she was here, that she wouldn't let anyone hurt her anymore. Then she turned and carried Eleanor quickly out the door, leaving Veronica standing stunned in the middle of the room. Iris carried Eleanor down the hallway to her own bedroom, a small room at the far end of the west wing that she knew could be locked from the inside. She laid Eleanor gently on the bed, pulled the blanket over her, then turned and locked the door with both the bolt and the key. Veronica chased after her, heels snapping furiously on the hallway floor, and she pounded on the door, shouting for Iris to open it right now. But Iris didn't open it. She leaned her back against the door, listened to the pounding and the curses outside, and for the first time in her life, she felt strong. Not strong in muscle, not strong in money or power, but strong in the way a person becomes when she finally decides to stand for what is right. When the pounding finally faded, and Veronica's footsteps moved away, Iris pulled her phone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been. She found the number Mrs. Walsh had given her in the earliest days, telling her to keep it for emergencies. Cole Brennan's number, Rhett Callahan's right-hand man, the only person who could reach the boss directly, no matter where he was. Iris pressed call and waited, her heart beating like a war drum. After 3 rings, Cole's low voice came through on the other end. Iris spoke fast but clear, giving him a brief account of what had happened. Veronica, Eleanor, everything. She said Eleanor needed Rhett, needed him back right now, because Iris didn't know how long she could keep her safe. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said 2 short words. "We're coming back." Then the call ended. Iris sat down beside the bed, took Eleanor's hand, and waited. Outside the window, the sky had turned a deep gray, and the first raindrops began to fall onto the surface of Lake Michigan. The storm was coming, but Iris wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in 27 years, she had stood up, she had spoken, she had refused to be a bystander in her own life. And whatever happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. Rhett was sitting in a conference room of a 5-star hotel in Manhattan when Cole walked in, his face more serious than usual. The negotiation had dragged on all day and still hadn't gone anywhere. The partners were trying to squeeze the price down and Rhett's patience was wearing thin. But when Cole leaned in and whispered a few short sentences into his ear, everything about the negotiation, about money, about his business empire, all of it became meaningless. Rhett stood up in the middle of the partner's sentence, didn't explain, didn't apologize, only said the meeting ends here, and walked out of the room. Cole had already arranged their private helicopter, and within 30 minutes, they were lifting off from the rooftop, headed straight for Chicago through the black night. Throughout the flight, Rhett sat in silence, staring out the window, his gray eyes dark as the moonless sky beyond the glass. Cole told him what Iris had said over the phone, about Veronica, about the white pillow, about the cruel words whispered into his mother's ear, about the way Eleanor screamed, and then fell silent, as if her soul had broken. Rhett didn't speak, didn't ask for more, but his hands clenched into fists so hard his knuckles went white. And Cole knew enough about his boss to understand that silence was more dangerous than any rage. Rhett Callahan wasn't a man who shouted when he was angry. He was a man who acted, and his actions usually came with a heavy price for someone else. Meanwhile, back at the Callahan mansion, Veronica was preparing for the biggest performance of her life. After realizing she couldn't break down Iris's door, and that the girl had called Cole, Veronica understood Rhett would be coming home, and she needed a perfect story to put the blame on someone else. She sat before the mirror in her bedroom, carefully making her eyes look red as if she'd been crying, dabbing a little water onto her cheeks to create tear marks, practicing an expression of worried pain. She rehearsed the story in her mind, that Iris had lost control, had somehow panicked Eleanor, and when Veronica tried to step in and help, Iris locked the door with the old woman inside and then blamed Veronica. Veronica would cry, would beg Rhett to believe her, would say she loved his mother so much and would never do anything to harm her. Veronica believed she could convince Rhett, because she'd always known how to handle men, and Rhett, cold as he was still a man. Close to 3 o'clock in the morning, the sound of a helicopter thundered over the mansion, and Veronica hurried to the main hall to greet Rhett with the perfectly rehearsed look of concern. She rushed into his arms the moment he stepped through the door, saying she'd been so worried, saying something horrible had happened, saying Iris had panicked his mother and she didn't know what to do. But Rhett didn't return her embrace. He stood rigid, arms hanging at his sides, his eyes looking straight through Veronica as if she were made of glass. Then he gently but firmly removed her hands from his body, said curtly that he needed to see his mother first. Veronica tried to follow, tried to keep telling her story, but Rhett was already moving fast toward the west wing without looking back. Iris heard a knock and Cole's voice calling her name. She unlocked the door cautiously, and when she saw Rhett standing there, his face dark under the hallway light, it felt as if a massive stone had been lifted off her chest. She stepped aside to let him in, into the room where Eleanor lay on the bed, her eyes closed but not asleep. Rhett went to the bedside, dropped to his knees next to his mother, and gently took her hand. "Mom, I'm home." His voice was low and trembling, carrying a tenderness Iris had never heard from this cold man. Eleanor opened her eyes, and for a moment her gaze was lost, not recognizing anyone. Then she saw Rhett, saw her son's face, and she began to cry. She cried without sound, only tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, and she clutched Rhett's hand as if she were afraid he would disappear. In a hoarse whisper from too much screaming that day, she said, "The snake, Rhett, the snake wanted to kill me. It said I'm a burden. It said Rosalie died because of me. It said you don't want me anymore." Rhett held his mother, let her cry into his shoulder, and then he looked over at Iris standing by the window. His eyes asked a question without words, and Iris nodded to confirm. Everything Eleanor had said was true. Rhett understood immediately. He didn't need more explanation, didn't need proof, because even with Alzheimer's, his mother never lied, and she had only ever called one person in this world the snake. He held her for a long time and whispered into her ear that he believed her, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt her again, that the snake would pay for what it had done. Then he stood, and his face had changed completely. The worried son was gone. In his place was the cold Mafia boss Chicago feared. He walked out of the room, and Iris knew Veronica Hayes was about to face a fury she'd never imagined. Rhett stopped in the middle of the hallway and turned back to look at Iris, who was still standing by the door. He gestured for her to follow, and Iris nodded, asking Cole to stay with Eleanor for a moment. She followed Rhett to his study, the room where she had stood months earlier, when he questioned her about his mother's condition and saw the scars on her wrist for the first time. Rhett closed the door, walked to the window that faced the black night outside, then turned back to face her. He didn't sit, didn't offer her a chair, only stood there with gray eyes fixed on her, waiting. In a low, tired voice, he said he wanted to hear everything, from beginning to end, without a single detail left out. Iris drew a deep breath, felt her hands trembling, and didn't try to hide it. She began to tell him, starting with that morning, with the uneasy premonition she'd woken with the moment she discovered every servant had been dismissed and the mansion was terrifyingly empty. She told him about seeing Veronica walking toward Eleanor's room with a white pillow in her hands, about how she tried to follow but Veronica ordered her to go fetch medication. She told him about the moment she came back and saw Veronica bent close, whispering into Eleanor's ear about the cruel things she said, calling Eleanor a burden, blaming her for Rosalie's death, saying no one loved her and she should disappear. She told him how Eleanor cried and trembled, how she called Rosalie's name in desperation, then went silent as if her spirit had been struck down. She told him how she dropped to her knees and begged Veronica to stop, and how Veronica threatened her with her past, with the files from the orphanage and the abusive household, saying Iris was nothing and would be destroyed if she dared to speak. Rhett stood in silence the whole time Iris talked, his face giving nothing away, but his eyes growing darker with every detail. Iris kept going, telling him how she decided she would not stay silent, how she stood up to Veronica, carried Eleanor out of the room, locked the door, and called Cole. She left nothing out, didn't dramatize anything, only told the truth exactly as it happened. Her hands shook as she spoke, but her voice didn't. Her voice stayed steady and clear, each word delivered with the certainty of someone who had decided she would not be afraid anymore. When she finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. Rhett stared at her for a long time, his eyes reading every line of her face, searching for any sign of lying or exaggeration, but he found nothing except the truth, and the exhaustion of someone who had fought all day to protect the person she loved. Finally, he spoke and asked her why. Why would she risk herself like that? She was only the caregiver. She could have walked away, could have pretended she hadn't seen anything, could have protected herself instead of confronting his fiancé. Why did she choose to stand up? Iris met his gaze and answered without hesitation. She said she had been silent her whole life. Silent when she was abandoned in the orphanage. Silent when she was abused in the adoptive home. Silent when no one believed her. Silent when she thought her voice had no value. But today, watching Eleanor being tormented, watching the old mother she loved like a real grandmother pushed to the edge of collapse, she realized her silence was no longer armor. It had become complicity with evil, and she refused to be complicit. Her voice trembled slightly, but it carried strength when she said she would not be silent anymore. Not ever again, no matter what it cost. Rhett looked at her, and in that moment, something changed in his eyes. The usual ice began to melt, just a little, revealing something softer, something warmer behind it. He nodded slowly, and he said two words Iris never expected to hear from him. I believe you. He said he believed her, not because he didn't believe Veronica, but because he knew Iris had no reason to lie, because his mother had called Veronica the snake from the very first day, because he had seen the way Iris loved Eleanor through these past months, and because in Iris's eyes he saw something he rarely saw in anyone at all, the absolute honesty of someone with nothing left to lose but the truth. Rhett stepped out of his study with the firm stride of a man who had made a decision and could no longer be moved. Iris followed behind him, not sure whether she should stay back or witness what was about to happen. But Rhett didn't tell her to leave, so she kept walking. Veronica was waiting in the main hall, sitting on the red velvet sofa with a perfectly performed look of worry. Her eyes reddened as if she'd been crying all night for Rhett. When she saw him coming down the stairs, she rose at once and hurried toward him, arms out as if to embrace him. But Rhett lifted a hand to stop her, and Veronica froze mid-step, the smile on her lips turning stiff when she met the ice in his eyes. Rhett stood a few paces away, close enough to see every expression cross her face, far enough to create a distance she couldn't cross. He didn't ask what happened, didn't demand an explanation, didn't give her the chance to deliver the story she'd rehearsed. He only looked at her in silence for nearly a full minute, letting that silence press down on the air like a sentence waiting to be spoken. Veronica began to feel uneasy. She opened her mouth to speak, to begin her performance, but Rhett cut her off with a single question. His voice was low and even, without emotion, without anger or grief, only absolute cold. Do you love my mother? Veronica went still. The question landed like a blade to the heart, not because it hurt, but because it was so sudden she hadn't prepared an answer. She'd prepared to be challenged about what happened, prepared explanations and blame, prepared tears and pleading. But she hadn't prepared for this simple question, the kind any fiancé should have been able to answer without thinking. "Do you love my mother?" Veronica parted her lips, about to say yes, about to say, "Of course I love your mother." But the words stuck in her throat, as if someone were choking them off. She realized that if she said yes, Rhett would ask why. And if you love my mother, then why did you say those things to her? And she had no answer that could cover the truth. The silence stretched, heavier with each passing second. Veronica stood there, mouth slightly open but no sound coming out, her eyes blinking too fast as she searched for an exit in a situation with none. And that silence answered for her, louder than any lie she could invent. Rhett nodded slowly, as if he'd expected the answer, as if the question had only been asked to confirm what he'd understood for a long time. In a voice that didn't waver, he said their engagement ended here. He would speak with the Hayes family about canceling the agreement, and whatever the consequences were, he was ready to face them. But Veronica had to leave the mansion immediately, and she would never set foot here again, never come near his mother again. Veronica snapped out of her frozen state, and panic flared. She stepped forward and tried to grab Rhett's hand, her voice turning sharp as she said he couldn't do this, that the Hayes family wouldn't accept this humiliation, that breaking the engagement would mean war between their families. She said she could explain, that things weren't what Rhett thought, that Iris had lied, had made everything up to frame her. She said she loved Rhett, that she would change. She would treat his mother well. She would do anything he wanted. But every word only made Rhett colder. And when she claimed Iris was lying, a first flash of anger cut through his eyes. Rhett said in an ice-cold voice that his mother had called Veronica the snake from the first day, and he hadn't listened. He'd thought she was only difficult, that she wouldn't accept any woman near her son, that Alzheimer's made her paranoid. But his mother wasn't paranoid. She'd seen Veronica's true nature from the beginning, while he'd been blinded by business calculations and power alliances. He said Iris wasn't lying, because Iris had no reason to lie, while Veronica had every reason. And he believed his mother, the woman who had given birth to him and loved him without condition for 36 years, more than he believed someone who only wanted to use him for power and position. Rhett turned to Cole, who was standing nearby, and gave an order in a voice that couldn't be argued with. "Get people to escort her out. She has 1 hour to pack her personal belongings. Anything that isn't hers stays in this mansion. And make sure she doesn't go near my mother's room." Cole nodded and signaled 2 security men to step forward. Veronica screamed, shouting that Rhett would regret this, that the Hayes family wouldn't let it go, that she would make him pay for this humiliation. But her screams only echoed through the empty hall as the guards moved her along, gentle but unyielding. Veronica tried to fight, tried to turn back for one last look at Rhett, but he had already turned away, not even bothering to watch her go. Iris stood near the staircase and witnessed it all in silence. She watched Veronica being taken away, watched the perfect, beautiful mask finally fall to reveal the ugliness beneath. She watched Rhett standing in the center of the hall, his back straight but his shoulders slightly lowered, like a man who had finally set down a burden he'd carried too long. And she understood this wasn't victory. No one won in this. Only the truth had finally been exposed, and the ones who deserved punishment were finally facing consequences. It wasn't victory. It was justice. After Veronica was taken away, the Callahan mansion sank into a strange quiet. Not the cold quiet it once had, but the quiet of a house that had just been freed from a ghost that had haunted it for far too long. Iris stayed with Eleanor until she fell into a deep sleep, Eleanor's hand still gripping Iris's even in her dreams. Only when Iris was sure she was all right, only when Mrs. Walsh had returned and settled in to keep watch beside the bed, did Iris leave the room. She didn't know where she wanted to go, only that she needed air, she needed space, she needed somewhere to breathe after everything that had happened. Her feet carried her without thinking to the garden behind the mansion, where the rosebeds slept under the dim light of dawn beginning to show along the horizon. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the sky washed clean and the air cool and heavy with moisture. Iris sat on the stone bench beside the koi pond, the place she often brought Eleanor on bright afternoons. She sat there watching the still water catch the first thin light of the new day, and she felt exhausted. Not physical exhaustion, though she hadn't slept all night, but the exhaustion of the mind, the heart, the weight of everything she had faced and survived in the past 24 hours. She had stood up, she had spoken, she had confronted someone 1,000 times more powerful than she was, and she hadn't broken. But now that it was over, She finally let herself feel how tired she truly was, as if the fatigue had been waiting in every cell of her body for permission to arrive. Iris didn't hear footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across her, blocking the weak dawn light. She lifted her head and saw Rhett standing there, no longer in the suit and dress shirt he'd worn to face Veronica, only a dark sweater and khaki pants, looking like an ordinary man instead of the powerful Mafia boss all of Chicago feared. His gray eyes were tired too, carrying the shadows of a sleepless night, but there was something different in them, something softer, warmer than Iris had ever seen from him. Rhett didn't ask if he could sit. He simply sat down beside her on the stone bench, leaving just enough space between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They only watched the pond's smooth surface and the dawn spreading slowly across the sky. Then Rhett spoke, his voice low and gentle, stripped of its usual chill. He said he owed her thanks, a kind of thanks he didn't know how to say well enough. She had saved his mother, not only yesterday, but from the first day she walked into this mansion. She had given his mother a reason to smile, a reason to wake each morning, someone to love while he was busy with work and meaningless power wars. She had done what he should have done, and had failed to do. Iris shook her head, wanting to say she hadn't done anything special, that she'd only done her job, that anyone would have done the same. But Rhett stopped her by placing a light hand over hers, only for a brief moment, but it was enough to quiet her. He said not everyone would have done it. He'd hired many caregivers before her, and none of them lasted longer than 3 months. None of them dared stand up to injustice to protect an old woman they had no obligation to protect. Iris had done it not for money, not out of duty, but because she truly loved his mother. And that was rarer than anything money could buy. Then Rhett said something Iris would never forget, something she would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. In a steady, honest voice, he told her she wasn't help anymore, not a caregiver, not hired staff. She was family. She was part of the Callahan family, and this mansion was her home, now and forever, if she wanted to stay. Iris looked at him, her green eyes wide, unable to believe what she'd just heard. She had lived 27 years in this world without belonging anywhere, without anyone calling her family, without anyone telling her she had a home. She had learned how to live without those things, learned to tell herself she didn't need to belong to anyone, that she could do it alone. But now, hearing those words from Rhett, she realized how long she'd been lying to herself. She did need a place to belong. She did need a family. She did need a home. And now, for the first time in her life, someone was offering her all of it. Tears rose, and Iris didn't try to stop them. She cried. Cried the way she'd never been allowed to cry. Cried for the 5-year-old orphan left behind in a bright, cold hospital. Cried for the 11-year-old girl who thought she'd found a family and was betrayed. Cried for the 27-year-old woman who had fought alone for her entire life. Rhett didn't speak, didn't try to comfort her with words. He only sat there beside her and let her cry. Let her finally spill everything she had held inside for too long. And his silent presence, somehow, comforted her more than any words ever could. 6 months had passed since that stormy night, and the Callahan mansion had become an entirely different place. The suffocating chill no longer crept into every corner. The dark secrets no longer hid behind heavy velvet drapes, and the ghost of fear and loneliness no longer circled the gray stone walls. Now laughter rose in rooms that had once been silent as a grave. Sunlight poured in through windows thrown wide open, and the scent of flowers drifted in from the garden like a reminder that spring had truly arrived in this house. Iris had stayed, but her role had changed completely. She was no longer a hired caregiver, no longer an orphan girl who came here looking for a job to survive. She had become an inseparable part of the Callahan family, treated like a daughter by Mrs. Walsh, loved and respected by the household staff, and most importantly, held as flesh and blood by Eleanor. The small room at the far end of the west wing where she used to sleep had been replaced with a larger, brighter room right beside Eleanor's, so Iris could be there whenever Eleanor needed her. Eleanor still had Alzheimer's. There was no miracle that could cure it, but she was far more stable. Her good days outnumbered her bad ones. Her lucid moments lasted longer, and her smile appeared more often than ever. The most miraculous change of all was that she had stopped calling Iris Rosalie, not because she had forgotten her lost daughter. Rosalie was still forever in her heart, but because she had learned how to love Iris as Iris, not as a substitute shadow. She called her Iris, her daughter, with all the tenderness and pride of a mother for the child she had chosen. Rhett had changed too, maybe more than anyone. He was still the powerful boss of Chicago's underworld, still cold and terrifying in the eyes of his enemies. But when he came back to the mansion, when he was with his mother and with Iris, he was someone else. He came home more often, ate dinner with the family every day, sat by his mother's bed each night to listen as Iris sang the familiar lullabies. He smiled more, even if it was only the smallest curve at the corner of his mouth. But it was something no one had believed could happen before. And the way he looked at Iris, the way he searched for her eyes when he entered a room, the way his hand brushed hers without thinking when they sat close, all of it spoke of something deeper than gratitude, something beginning to bloom, waiting for the right moment to be named. One autumn afternoon, when the maple leaves had turned a fierce red and honey gold sunlight filled the garden, Iris wheeled Eleanor out to sit by the koi pond, the way she often did. But today something felt different. Rhett was there too, not working in his office or out in the city handling business, but sitting on the familiar stone bench, waiting for them. When Eleanor saw her son, she smiled, bright as sunlight, and reached her hand out to him. Rhett stepped forward, knelt beside his mother's chair, took her hand, and kissed the wrinkled back of it. Iris stood nearby watching mother and son, and her heart filled with a warm feeling she didn't know how to name. Eleanor looked from Rhett to Iris, then back to Rhett, her eyes clear and lucid in a way that was rare. She took both their hands, pulled them closer, and she spoke with a voice trembling with emotion, but every word was as clear as crystal. Her family. This is her family, her son and her daughter. She didn't need anything more. Rhett and Iris looked at each other, and in that moment, without words, they understood they had found what both of them had been searching for all their lives. A family, a place to belong, a true home. The three of them sat together in the golden afternoon light, beside the koi pond where the fish glided beneath the clear water, beneath the red maple canopy where leaves drifted down like butterflies. Eleanor sat in the middle, one hand holding Rhett's, one hand holding Iris's, and she began to sing softly, "You Are My Sunshine," the song Rosalie once sang, the song Iris had sung to her through all these months. Rhett and Iris sang along, their voices blending with the old woman's trembling voice, forming a melody that wasn't perfect, but was more beautiful than any symphony. And in that moment, there was no mafia boss, no orphan girl, no old woman with Alzheimer's. There was only a family loving each other, healing each other's wounds, writing a new story together. This story teaches us that family isn't always the people who share our blood. Sometimes family is the people who choose to stay, who choose to protect one another, who choose to love one another, no matter how harsh the circumstances are. It reminds us that staying silent in the face of evil isn't wisdom. It is complicity, and sometimes it only takes one person willing to stand up to change an entire ending. It shows us that our past doesn't define us, that scars don't make us weak, and that everyone deserves to be loved and to belong somewhere. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so more people can listen to meaningful stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about the story of Iris, Eleanor, and Rhett. Have you ever met someone like them in real life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We always cherish reading every line that comes from the deepest part of your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.